This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
It being 1 a.m., pursuant to an order made earlier today, it's my duty to interrupt the proceedings and put forthwith every question necessary to dispose of the third reading stage of the bill now before the House.
The question is as follows. Mr. Guilbeault, seconded by Ms. Shaw, moves that Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts, as amended, be read a third time and passed.
The Liberal government strategy to push through Bill C-10 bore fruit last week, as the controversial Broadcasting Act Reform Bill received House of Commons approval at 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning. The parliamentary process took hours as the government passed multiple motions to cut short debate, reinserted amendments that had previously been ruled null and void, and rejected a last-ditch attempt to restore the Section 4.1 safeguards for user-generated content. Bill C-10 proceeded to receive first reading in the Senate later that same day. After a series of Senate maneuvers, it received second reading from Senator Dennis Dawson the following day, which sparked Senate debate in which everyone seemed to agree that the bill requires significant study and should not be rubber-stamped. Speeches are likely to continue this week, after which the bill will be sent to committee. Given that the committee does not meet in the summer, an election call in the fall would kill Bill C-10. Here to discuss the latest developments is Peter Menzies, a former vice chair of the CRTC and one of the most outspoken experts on Bill C-10. Our conversation reflects on the last 2 months of the Bill C-10 debate, discusses the concerns regarding CRTC regulation, and explores what comes next. Peter, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, I'm happy to be here as always.
Okay, I'm really glad to have you here. So we're recording this just a couple days after the House of Commons adjourned for the summer, in a week when it passed Bill C-10 in the middle of the night as the cloud was winding down on this particular session. Now, the bill's gone to the Senate, where we've already heard a few speeches, including one I thought was a really excellent one from Paula Simons. But at this stage, it looks fairly certain, you never know with the Senate, but it looks fairly certain, or at least likely, that the bill will be referred to a Senate committee for further study. And given that we don't think that the committee will be meeting over the summer, that suggests that Bill C-10 will be picked up again in the fall if there's no election call. But if there is that election call, then Bill C-10 will die. And so I thought this provides a good opportunity to reflect back on what I think both of us would agree has been a pretty remarkable couple of months. You know, it seems that if we go back to April, this bill looked certain to pass and was not generating much public attention or opposition. And that obviously changed with the removal of Section 4.1 and the application of the statute to user-generated content. I thought it would be fun to have a conversation about what we've experienced over the last couple of months. And why don't we start with this? We've obviously both been very active and vocal on this bill. You know, what stands out to you from the last couple of months in this battle over Bill C-10?
I think the thing that stands out the most for me is how thin the grasp of many people is of basically what the internet is, as opposed to, broadcasting or even a telephone line or cable. There's so much of the discussion was almost backward looking instead of forward looking. And I mean, even people commenting, well, C-10 doesn't do this and doesn't do that. And yeah, that's fair enough. But actually the Broadcasting Act does. And this is an amendment to the Broadcasting Act, so et cetera, et cetera. I found that the most frustrating thing, which is why Paula Simon's speech came as was so refreshing the other day.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It was a breath of fresh air, certainly, I think, to have someone inject a bit more facts and discussion into this. Yeah, how do we get past that, just as a starting point? I mean, it's clear that you'll have politicians sometimes from all the different stripes retreat to talking points, the kind of hearings that we saw and debate at times that we saw from many of the parties didn't really rely, I don't think, on kind of that deeper understanding of the technology. And certainly it was very much of a backward looking approach. At least that would be my perspective. You have thoughts on how that kind of policy development dynamic might change?
Well, I'm kind of hopeful. It's nice. It's nice that there'd be a break. I think if Bill C-10 dies on the order paper over the summer, I'm not sure even the government will regret it, because it's been so difficult for them, and I think they've had a difficulty getting their own heads around it and what it means in terms of that. Obviously, the CanCon lobby would be disappointed, but I don't think anybody else would be. Their thinking did manage to prevail, which is amazing because it hasn't really changed in 24 years. I'm hoping, on the other hand, that if if the Senate is resuming and considering it in September, that it will do a thorough vetting of it. I mean, the Senate can still play an intelligent role here, and emotions die down over the summer. People can be more practical. People can start looking at it, and maybe the Senate can, and the process involved in the Senate can provide some sensible amendments that the government could consider in terms of narrowing the scope, and at least trying to use some more precise tools to get the outcomes they want. I mean, if you want to, if it is what Guilbeault has frequently described it as, just an effort to get online streamers to contribute more money, then just do that. I think the big mistake is, and Paula put it well too. I mean, you're taking an institution like the CRTC and giving it this vast scope when you don't need to, if that's not really what you want to do, then don't do it. So I don't know, maybe everybody just chills out a little over the summer and becomes a little less partisan in terms of their approach to it.
Yeah, no, you mentioned Senator Simon's speech. There's a few things that she raises in that speech. I'd encourage people to take the 12 minutes or so to listen to it or watch it on YouTube. I thought it really does a phenomenal job of raising some of the issues. One of the questions that she raised is, precisely, and I'll quote her, where does Canada find the legal authority, the moral right, and most importantly, the practical power to regulate the content of international streaming services that are not broadcast over the Canadian airwaves? What is the legal nexus to regulate or curate programming from international companies? And while I know that some people will take that to suggest, that the internet is somehow this non-regulable, no holds barred, no lawless environment, I don't think that really that's what she's suggesting. I think she's saying there is a role for law to play, but we also need to recognize the limits of the law. How do you seek to reconcile some of those tough questions? Because once the people started focusing on this legislation, I thought one of the things that really did get attention was just that enormous scope, as it sought to essentially say that any service anywhere offering up audio or visual services, so long as there was some kind of Canadian connection, would at least in theory be subject to CRTC regulation.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where you first get the impression when you read something like that that's what they want to do. I mean, my first reaction anyway, is these guys don't understand what they're doing, right? They don't understand the size of this. It's like deciding that you're going to regulate the universe. You're dealing with something infinite, and you're trying to deal with it with a finite set of tools and a broadcasting act which deals with a finite world and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, the main giveaway there is that these guys, they don't get it. They don't understand the internet in terms of that. And yeah, the internet isn't, like people say, well, it's like the Wild West, and blah, 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 blah. And that, it's not. I mean, the law applies to the internet, right? It's applied to things you do on the internet must be legal. This is about, the difference between regulating, not even regulating. I mean, you have laws that the internet is not allowed to break, or people on the internet are not allowed to do and say and that sort of stuff in various countries. But you don't need to do that by regulating the internet. I mean, criminal code applies, civil law, you can't libel people, you can't slander them. I mean, there's many, we've talked about this before. There's many things that need to be addressed about the internet. It's with us. It's going to be with us for a long time. It's new problems get created, monopolies get created, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, to Senator Simon's point, in terms of that, like hers was a very polite way of sort of saying, "Who the hell do you think you are?" that you can pull this off. So it's that, like I said, that's where it's to finish where I started. It's like, do you guys really understand the internet?
Yeah, no, I think she even raised that towards the end in a question and answer. What are we doing here in certain respects? The other framing that she raised, one was, of course, with respect to the internet itself, but the other was with respect, I thought, even more to cultural policy. And she again raised this question, and I'll quote, is cultural protection still the fundamental model we wish to employ in 2021, or do we need a paradigm shift that puts the emphasis on preparing our tech and culture sectors to be robust players on a global stage, taking outstanding Canadian content created in French, English, Mandarin, and Punjabi, etc., to the world? In some ways, she's reiterating what actually the former Heritage Minister Melanie Joly talked about with her initial foray into cultural policy. I suspect I know the answer, but where do you see the opportunities from a cultural policy perspective? Do you see the prospect of that kind of moving towards the sort of paradigm shift that Senator Simons raises?
Well, that was what was so disappointing about C-10 and before that, the BTLR outcomes, that it became this, we have to, like we're going to modernize Canada's communications policy by modernizing the Broadcasting Act, when there was this wonderful opportunity here to really take a look at some of the issues that you just raised there. Like, why would a system that was designed for, the 1980s make sense in 2021? How can we own the internet? Go back to that CRTC report, which was, even entitled, harnessing change, right? Rather than, achieving great things through change or something like that. Like, how do we build a bigger, better model and that sort of stuff? There was no imagination. There was just, to me, it seemed like the government was just captive to one certain lobby group and perspective that was very regressive in its approach, that everything is broadcasting, right? And this is how we must do it. I mean, the original system was designed to, basically because people could watch TV from the States and Toronto, and you're protecting people from that. And if you've only got one source coming in, it's from a giant the size of the United States, and there's definite issues there where Canadian broadcasters can buy American programming at 10 cents on the dollar and that sort of stuff. There's huge issues there, but the other side is just this opportunity it creates, like how many people were actually achieving the objectives of the Broadcasting Act without being licensed, without being captured, without being regulated by the CRTC. I remember meeting a guy several years ago now, and he was talking about, he did a lot of, he's a sort of a South Asian specialty channel. And he did a lot of work, and he was talking about, he said, why do you do so much programming in English, right? Why isn't it all in Punjabi or something like that? And he said, well, because he was talking about designing it for export as well. And he said, well, there's 125 million Anglophones in India, right? Which is, 5 times as many as there are in Canada. So, these are the markets that are out there, and you're not just telling Canada's stories to Canadians, but you're telling them to the world, right? So people could actually be successful, but psychologically, so much of the industry is just comfortable in this cocoon that it's built. And I find that kind of sad. I really do, like there's a lot of smart people. There's a lot of good creative people in the country, and to not get excited about the internet and say, oh boy, what can we do with this, is kind of shocking from a government that fancies itself as being the most progressive in history.
Yeah, no, I think we started to hear some of those voices towards the end of this process just now. Hopefully, they'll have a chance to be heard if this does go to hearings. Much of your contribution focused on the CRTC, or at least a lot of people were interested in the fact that a former vice chair of the CRTC would be speaking out in the way that you did. Is the CRTC, again, there's a sense based on your public comments, is the CRTC the right venue for this? Or even more, I suppose, is it capable of addressing these issues? And if not, what needs to change? Or is it simply the case that this is just an ill-fitting regulator for the kinds of issues that the government entertains in the bill?
Yeah, I don't think the CRTC, the CRTC, one of the, BTLR recommendations was that you can create a new Canadian Communications Commission. And I think it's time for that. The CRTC is not bad at a lot of the things it does. It's pretty good at many of those sorts of things, but it was created for an entirely different purpose. And a different systems, closed systems, one-way systems, all kinds of differences, and control of speech systems. Like people sort of say, well, C-10 doesn't, regulate speech. Well, the CRTC does, though. That's kind of all it does. It's kind of its purpose is to regulate a certain type of content. The licenses all have detail about that, and it's when they do that, it's transactional. Right, it's between the applicant for the license and the CRTC, and it's public property, and you can make those deals or you can reject them. Being able for it to be able to culturally and intellectually get its head around those differences and try to apply that general mentality and mission to something like the internet, which is so different, I think is a huge challenge. I don't know how you take it to a group of people in the broadcasting division and say, okay, here's the regulation. Here's how we regulate religious channels, for instance, right? How are we going to apply that to the internet? Well, you can't. It just becomes impractical without deregulating, into a certain extent, some of the stuff you do on broadcasting. So the confusion that it would create, I think, inside there, where you're trying to apply a set of rules designed for one thing to another thing that doesn't fit, would be monstrous, and it would bog down the CRTC for ages and ages. So, creating something brand new. If you're going to get into regulating the internet, be very specific about it, and create an entirely new culture, I think would be the way to go.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you talk about sort of that different approach, at least in terms of the regulatory side. You did just reference the fact that, of course, there are all those regulations for the existing broadcasters. Now, I've argued that the arguments around, or the claims around, a level playing field have never been entirely forthcoming, or certainly not accurate. I don't think that there are an assortment of advantages that the regulated sector has when they get those licenses, that this is a bit of a quid pro quo. You get the hundreds of millions in benefits, let's say, that come from simultaneous substitution and the must carry rules, so that everybody's paying for certain channels when they get these packages, even if they don't necessarily want them for the most part, or they may want them, but they may not. It's all just part of the deal. And so in return for some of those benefits, you make some payments and there's a contribution back, which I never thought really applied in the same way to the online environment. But certainly you do get some that will say, if these internet-based services are not going to be regulated, neither should we. Where do you see this going? Do you see sort of the continued push for take the old existing rules to the internet? Do you see the opposite, saying basically, fine, if there's no internet regulations, we'll deregulate the remaining space? Or do you think we can have a bit of a coexistence between the two, where there are rules that apply to the internet, but they're not the same rules that apply to the conventional broadcasting sector?
Well, it depends, precisely what you want to get it from the internet. If it was as simple as Minister Guilbeault had suggested many times, we just want to make sure that those guys are contributing to the creation of Canadian film and television, right? I mean, there's a good argument that they already are spending tons of money creating Canadian. I mean, the Canadian film and television industry is doing very well. And one of the reasons it's doing very well is because of streamers. It'd be easy enough to create something where let's take a look at it and find out if they're contributing. And then if you wanted to, you could say, okay, well, as long as you're going to operate here, we want to make sure that you're contributing what you are, and you are, and you don't even have to fuss about whether it goes through a fund or not. Just how much are you spending in Canada, roughly? I mean, I'm being a little facetious there, but you could manage things that way, because there's arguments, and you know, I'm sympathetic with many of them. Like you can't just take money out of this country and not leave anything behind. You wouldn't let any other industry do that in terms of taxes or investment or anything like that. So you can take that approach and simplify it, I think, and then everything goes ahead. Or you can actually, I mean, the other option would be if you want to level the playing field, why does it have to be with making everybody's burden as heavy as the current burden is? Why not lighten the load on some of the people within the system? In terms of that, I don't think that option has even been examined. And then the other option is to just is to take the current rules and try to apply it to the internet as if the internet is broadcasting. And I'm afraid that it's that last one that they seem to be trying to do, because basically what they're saying is that the internet is broadcasting, which it isn't, right? But as long as they think that it is, they must think that the rules they apply to broadcasting can be applied to the internet. And that just, there's no way that ends well. It would just end in chaos in terms of that, because the CRTC just isn't equipped for that.
You know, I think you may have just answered my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. You know, let's say the Senate does hold some hearings. So that election call that everyone's expecting doesn't come, and the review of C-10 continues. And the committee hopefully makes a point of hearing from many voices that were omitted during the House of Commons hearings. And there is a long list, from consumer groups to digital first creators to, frankly, people like yourself. So let's say they ask you to appear. You've become really a vocal part of the C-10 debate. You know, what do you tell them if you had that opportunity to appear before the committee?
Well, I mean, I would tell them that they should reject the bill because it's poorly founded. But if they're going to, if it's going to pass, the best thing is to narrow its focus, make it precise, get clarity on the purpose of the amendments to the Broadcasting Act, and carve out from the internet the sector that you want to regulate. So if you, for instance, be precise, say pick a number, but this will only apply to streaming companies with revenues of more than, 100 million, 80 million. The web giants Gilbo talks about, right? So this will only apply to them. And the purpose of this is to make sure that they are investing or spending a certain amount of money in the Canadian film and television industry. And you can keep it as simple as that. You don't really need a vast amount of regulation to do that. I mean, the CRTC's got $4 million extra bucks in this year's budget alone, just to figure out how many more millions of dollars it would need to, regulate the infinity of the internet. So just make it simple for everybody. Narrow the focus. Say, this is what we want to do. What's the purpose of it? We want to get the big guys who are taking lots of money out of Canada. We want to make sure that they're investing money in Canada. And at the end of it, today, they might look at it and say, hey, it's working just fine. Let's just keep going like we're doing, roughly. Because largely C-10 is a solution in search of a problem, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you raised the need to put some thresholds into the bill, be more explicit about it. That I know that was certainly one of the issues that I raised right off the top, that if anything, I thought the bill always just created way too much uncertainty within the sector, leaving so much to the CRTC to decide. And at first the government said, well, we're going to provide more detail in a policy directive. But once at least a draft of that policy directive was made available, when the committee said, hey, since you've only provided half the bill, let's see the other half in the policy directive, it didn't provide really much more certainty at all. There was very little in the way of information on what those thresholds would look like.
I know, it was shocking, wasn't it?
It was remarkable to see how little guidance was being provided. You sat on the CRTC for years. I guess how do you see this? How do you think the CRTC manages in that kind of environment where it becomes fairly close to a blank slate in terms of the lack of direction or specificity that's coming out of the legislation or being provided by the government?
Well, I mean, people have to be practical, and the CRTC people can be practical. I mean, I expect that, my guess is, based on my experiences, people would look at it at first and say, okay, we have to create this, carve this up and put it into digestible bite sizes, and that sort of stuff. So if the government didn't, I would think that the first thing the CRTC would do would go in and narrow its own scope and focus. It would have to go through a consultation process, though, to do that. And that would take a certain amount of time to sort that out. The problem with having the broad scope is that there will always be one group or another somewhere who can benefit from the widening of the scope. And so they will, as we have seen, inevitably wear them down. They will show up at hearings and say, yeah, you've said this only applies to people with $100 million or more in revenue or whatever. Here's some reasons why it should apply to people with 50 million, right? Or you've narrowed it in this way, and people will continue. And what you'll get is, scope creep in terms of that. That'll just, it's inevitable. The broader unless your legislation really shows where the fences are, people will spend a lot of time taking those fences down, and it will just happen, inch by inch.
That's a really important observation. And I think in some ways it applies not just to what that process would look like at the CRTC, where those with the most at stake will be the ones that show up and make the biggest commitment to doing so in terms of financially benefiting. But the impact is so disparately felt amongst individual Canadians that most will not bother to take the time to show up. And in some ways, the same thing takes place in the policymaking realm, right? I mean, the minister never failed to reference a series of lobby groups that were supportive of the legislation. Well, no surprise. They thought they were going to get big checks coming out of this to help fund their activity. And that would ultimately be paid by consumers. And so millions of Canadians would be affected. But it's much tougher to get individual Canadians to speak out again and again and again. And we learned that they are willing to speak out. And sometimes it's on the consumer side, but it's also very much when it comes to the freedom of expression concerns, where there's a willingness to regulate. But if you start really limiting the kinds of things I get to see on my service, or you impose a new regulator that's going to have the kind of role that we've been talking about, it's quite clear that's going to raise objections. Have any thoughts, especially at a CRTC level, about how we go about ensuring a more representative discussion? It was, I think, frustrating for many throughout this policymaking process where, as I say, the minister kept referencing the same groups again, and you had a lot of other groups who were never heard from, and oftentimes were really deeply concerned with this legislation. But of course, the minister didn't take the time to reference them, much less show any interest in what they had to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we've seen or has been discussed regarding other decisions, there's a systemic bias. It's not intended, but it's built up over the years. So when the CRTC holds a process, sort of posts a notice of consultation or something like that, or notice of public hearing, nobody pays any attention to that other than the usual suspects, right? The people who are stakeholders in the system, the people who are going to contribute to the system, to to the hearing, create the record, which is very important for staff at the CRTC to try to have a full record and that sort of stuff. But most of the people who are going to show up live within a half day's drive of Ottawa, and they will be there. I mean, you saw that in the setup with the BTLR panel itself. Hank Infant was the only one who didn't live within a half day's drive of Ottawa. And that's nothing against the people who do. It's just that's not very representative of a really big country, right? So until the CRTC actually starts, like it used to do this quite a bit. Conrad was pretty good about that. Like when Shaw was taking over Global, the hearing was held in Calgary. We did I remember kind of stomping my feet and talking him into holding the Northwest Tel hearing. We had it in Yellowknife, and later we did another Northwest Tel hearing in Inuvik and then Whitehorse. And it makes a difference, right? Location makes a difference to your point of view in terms of that, your understanding of issues. When people talk about being remote, and it's one thing to conceive it intellectually. It's another thing to get on a plane in Yellowknife and fly for 2.5 hours north before you land and have looked at all that territory underneath you and the mountains and valleys and rivers. And you go, okay, I think I'm getting this remote thing. Like it makes a huge difference. So it's incumbent upon organizations like the CRTC, whether it's, competitor access rates or something like that, to make sure you hear from everybody, you hear from them and understand that you got to get off your backside in Gatineau and get out and see the country a little bit. If you're going to be in Gatineau, all you're going to hear from is Bell and Rogers and Videotron and ACTRA and Les Artistes and everybody, all the same. If you get out and move it around, you got to invest in it. If you move around, you're going to get a full record, because nobody here, like out west, I'm in Regina today, like it's nobody here really cares about the CRTC or has heard of the CRTC. Nobody's going to bother getting on a plane and going down there and talk to them, right? CRTC is kind of a big deal in Ottawa, but that's kind of the only place where it is.
Okay, it is, and it is a big deal there, and certainly in the Toronto Quebec corridor, it plays a role too. Why don't we close with this? You talk about different regions and their different perspectives on some of these issues. There was a perception amongst many that the government's determination to, at a minimum, get this bill through the House of Commons, and to do so, even if it meant stifling debate, even if it meant overruling the chair and passing a whole series of amendments that had never been made public, much less read into the record so that people would understand what MPs were voting on. So they were willing to throw out a lot of kinds of things that I thought that they once said was central to foundational democracy. Clearly, they thought there was some political benefit for doing so. And the perception is that this is an issue that plays well in Quebec and perhaps less well in the rest of the country. So as I say, why don't we close with this? What's your view on first, whether or not we see these kinds of issues become part of the electoral discussion, the election campaign, if there is one early in the fall? And I guess secondly, your thoughts on sort of the differences across the country. So get out and let's see the different parts of the country. There is a sense that even the perspective on the very issues we're talking about, like Bill C-10, are viewed differently in different parts of the country.
Yeah, certainly they're viewed differently in different parts of the country, but it's not just all geography. I should add it. There's people who aren't organized, right? Like the YouTubers and that sort of stuff. There isn't an association. There isn't a guild. They don't have a formal lobby group. These are the people who are typically become disenfranchised by the system. They're too busy out there creating and trying to make money and doing things like that to be bothered with all this all this regulatory nonsense. So that's where, I mean, the Senate could come in, and that's where further consultation could be required. Like I think originally with Bill C-10, like even the Conservatives were largely on side with, if not with the specifics, but with the general approach that, playing field must be balanced and that sort of stuff. And I think that's mostly because, they get lobbied by a group that comes in and they say, we represent 200,000 artists and creators and that sort of stuff. And you think that that's all there is, right? So the organized group comes in and says it represents everybody, and you believe them, and they seem to have a consensus viewpoint, and you don't see that there could possibly be anything contentious in that. And so this process, like over the summer and further, all of a sudden people pop up and go, hey, what about me? Hey, whoa, wait a second. What are you doing here? Like, there's 106, there might be 200,000 of them, but there's almost 200,000 people who are uploading things to YouTube and that sort of stuff. And you get an entirely different perspective. And I think that, to sort of segue, I think that's where the Conservatives must have seen the political opportunity in terms of this, that there's a constituency that they discovered late in the day, but good for them, they did discover it, that was going to be negatively impacted by this, and unnecessarily so, and probably a certain constituency of their own that at their base that had concerns about the freedom of expression and suspicions on that. The end result seems to have been that both the Conservatives and the Liberals seem quite comfortable campaigning around this. I think the Liberals are see the one of the barriers to the gaining a majority as being the Bloc Québécois throughout Quebec, and particularly in heavily francophone ridings, and this sort of bill, this sort of protectionism, is a tradition that is hundreds of years old in Quebec. Preservationism, existentialist angst, perfectly understandable, but quite different than in English Canada. And so I think primarily there it's about not letting the Bloc out protect them, that they have to show that they can be more protective of Francophone Canada than the Bloc in terms of that. I mean, in the meantime, they can portray the Conservatives as, antediluvian knuckle draggers, but they would be doing that anyway, in terms of that sort of stuff. And for the Conservatives, they can see themselves as, people fighting for personal liberties and that sort of stuff, and both in Quebec and outside, and try to cover themselves with that. So it seems like politically, both of them think they can use Bill C-10 to their political advantage, which doesn't necessarily make for great legislation.
No, it doesn't. But it does suggest that in some ways we haven't heard from the last of Bill C-10. Even if the bill itself doesn't go forward with an election call, it could well become part of the discourse throughout the campaign. So thanks for the work that you've been doing, and thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for bringing me on. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate the knowledge that you've brought to this conversation. And I know you've put in hard work. You've basically been you've been the guy reporting on it every day, and that's really helped keep the public informed. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.